In his 1933 inaugural address, after first taking office as US President, Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered some of his most quoted words. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Now, fear can be one of the most pervasive forces in our decision-making, whether we are conscious of it or not. Stemming from our evolutionary roots, where our emotional and physiological states were our body's most effective way of protecting itself, it is rather strange that these days we can still feel intense anxiety about doing non-life-threatening events such as giving a public speech or even just looking at our financials. A big part of walking our journeys means coming up to snowstorms of fear, areas that, as much as it makes us want to turn back, we must confront and we must steadily wade through if we're going to reach our destination. I must advise that fear is a complex issue and often emotionally charged subject, and this single episode can't give one answer to deal with all sorts of fears such as complex phobias and anxieties. However, what we will do is explore how to tell the difference between two core types of fear so that we can tell when it is worth listening to and when to keep walking forwards through to the other side. First, let's start off with a story. Welcome to Redlily Radio. Radio. The 5 months that I lived in Mexico City were transformative for me for a number of reasons, which is why you may have heard me mention it before. However, one of the most potent lessons I took from my time there was a lesson and an encouragement of bravery. One of the people I got to know quite well was a handyman, Jose, who had built a house for his family by his own hands. Now, Jose isn't his real name, but the person I am talking about is real. In his early 40s, Jose would invite me over to join his family for dinner. I knew that they were not financially well off, and so their generosity of feeding me was a deeper kind of generosity, giving away food that was probably not even spare for them. Jose would take me around various places in Mexico City, showing me the ropes of public transport and taking me through places like the epic cathedrals that were there, the beating heart of Mexican Catholicism. This was a faith that Jose held closely. Now, Jose didn't speak English, and my Spanish was growing very slowly. So at first, our conversations originally consisted of a lot of pointing and laughing at things. But even with the lack of mutual words, his warmth was evident immediately. Gradually, my Spanish got better, and I was able to ask him questions of a bit more depth. Which is why, at about 4 months in, there was this weird kind of character backstory reveal of Jose that usually only happens in movies. And this is when our conversations had moved to his childhood. You see, Jose came from an indigenous family, which means Spanish wasn't even his first language. Nahuatl was. Jose didn't learn Spanish at school either, because he never actually got the chance to go to school. The family that he had come from was hit with extreme financial hard times, and as a result he was forced to leave home and live on the street from around ages 8 to 11. Scrounging for food in bins, the kind of thing that we usually only see in comedy movies over here, was an actual reality for this child. But he survived. And not only did he survive, but Jose ended up teaching himself how to read and write Spanish from the newspapers that he would collect. As he was telling me this, I was watching his face, and I could tell that it was not a fun time for him to reflect on, but he held no real bitterness about it either. And here he was today, decades later, and one of the warmest and most giving people I've ever met in my life. Curious to his secret of survival, I asked him what kept him going through his years on the street. How can a child like that have that level of resilience? Mi fe, he said, my faith. Now, I wouldn't call myself a religious person, but I've taken Jose's story with me since then. And when I touched back down in Australia, I was able to look at many of the things I feared, especially the fear of failing, of attempting my deeper goals. I realized that yes, I might go through hard times, emotionally and financially, but if Jose can survive on the street for years and still live to be warm, happy and strong, what do I really have to fear over here? Gradually, I learned that there are actually different types of fear, and the kind that used to stop me from taking the healthy actions in my life is the kind that I would call emotional fear, the snowstorm. There are different names and understandings between the different types of fear that we experience, depending on which model you subscribe to. But I have come to understand a helpful differentiation between the blanketing emotional fear and what I would call a discrete fear. I often think of emotional fear as a metaphorical snowstorm because it is blinding, obscuring, even sometimes paralyzing. It's the strong physiological fear that makes us really not want to do something. And telling someone just to get over this fear is like telling someone to get over a snowstorm. Chances are that they can't simply just make it go away with a nice thought, though they probably are able to walk through it, even if slowly. This can be the kind of fear that stops us from giving a public speech or asking someone out on a date. But it might actually also get in the way of us doing a range of things that might be important steps on our journey. Now the problem is, often this emotional fear kicks in quickly from the amygdala and the other emotional hubs of our brain, and it feels so strongly that the rational areas of our brain create seemingly logical justifications to match it. When we're not ready for it, it happens too quickly for us to notice, and it feels logical. This is why it is so easy for us to talk ourselves of doing things that are actually important for us, but we feel scared to do. Built on ancient physiological systems that evolved for avoiding predators, these days, even things as menial as everyday office issues can set off these life and death rush systems through our veins and our brain. Now I hear people often say, but fear is still important to protect us from being robbed or from hurting ourselves. But I'm increasingly becoming an adamant believer that with our brain's more recent additions of the frontal lobes, which control complex and rational thinking, we're actually still able to keep ourselves alive effectively without needing that sting of emotional fear to guide us. It's this more conscious, more rational process towards danger that I call discrete fear. The key part being that it is through conscious thought rather than automatic feeling that we can actually decide whether something is a danger to us or not. But also through this conscious thought, we can decide whether we can still proceed and how we should proceed. Discrete fear still works as a good informant in our decision making, but it's a little more nuanced. It doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, imagine that your favorite retail store is right down the end of the street, 200 meters down the road. Unfortunately, a busy season has left this road with a number of potholes through it, a potential danger for you tripping and falling in. Now, emotional fear would essentially block off the entire street and tell you that you shouldn't even go to the retail store, it's just too dangerous. But discrete fear would say, there are potholes here and you should be careful of them. Proceed with caution around them, but if you do, you'll still be able to walk down the road and you'll still make it to the store. You see how one becomes a limiting force in our lives, but the other actually becomes a tool to help us succeed? This is why it's important to practice being able to discern which type of fear is currently running through our minds. Take a moment and look over where you are in your life, on your journey right now. Take a look at your options for where you could head next, where would take you closer to your goal, or be healthy for you. Are there any options that you've been quickly rejecting out of this emotional fear? Now, up until this point, we've really been talking about the danger of fear stopping you from doing something that you believe that you should actually do. Pushing through this fear and acting is often what's implied when people talk about bravery. But it's actually also worth looking at the times when you feel pushed to do something, but the force that is pushing you is actually fear. This is one of those more difficult times to discern fear at work. I think one of the strongest examples of this is when people go into romantic relationships, not because they know it's a genuinely great relationship for them, but because they actually fear being single. Often with time, if the relationship's actually just built on the fear of being alone, or some other kind of fear, all the little incompatibilities start to become a bit more obvious and the resentment starts building up, sometimes unfortunately turning toxic. Now, this type of action pushed by fear isn't limited to relationships. It can be happening in any area of life, professional, personal, with your family, with your friends. And often it comes with the thought that I should be doing this or I should take this action. The key word here being should. Now, obviously life isn't black and white, and these situations can have a range of forces acting on them. But it's really important to take a moment when you notice these thoughts crossing your mind and ask yourself, am I doing this out of the fear of something? Or I'm doing this because I genuinely believe it's healthy for me? Asking these types of questions can often help clarify the healthy options from the fear-driven ones, which is a skill becoming more and more important in our fast-paced world today. Sometimes these questions can be the anchors that keep us and our energy from being blown around all over the place. Discerning between emotional fear and discrete fear does take practice, as does actually walking forwards through the snowstorms of emotional fear. But that's just it. With practice, we do get better at it. We may never be able to get rid of these feelings of fear, but with more practice, we get better at moving wisely through it anyway. Acting in the face of fear is bravery. Resisting fear-driven, desperate action is patience. And being able to keep moving where we decide amongst all these fears, that's freedom. Redlily Radio is produced as part of Redlily Coaching, where we leverage one-on-one coaching, technologies, and this podcast to help grow your personal direction and empower your life in our increasingly technological world. For more information, visit www.redlilycoaching.com.